Great, great. Well, thank you all for being here. My name is Stephen Fee. I'm with Physicians for Human Rights here in New York. And this is a very informal book conversation with Mark Fallon, who's the author of Unjustifiable Means, the inside story of how the CIA, Pentagon, and US government conspired to torture. Just so everyone here in the room knows and everyone watching knows, Mark was for 27 years a special agent with the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, counterintelligence expert, and an expert on interrogations, and of course was on the ground immediately after 9/11 in Guantanamo and elsewhere, seeing firsthand the deployment of what became these strategies of torture that the US government employed in the wake of 9/11. We'll just be asking some questions, and we'll have some great questions also from our own Sarah Doherty, who is our senior US anti-torture fellow. She just published a report over the summer about the experimental nature of the torture program, and particularly about the health professionals who were involved in the health program. And that's part of the theme of our conversation today. I think we'll really be focusing on Mark's accounts of those things. So let's, if it's okay with you, we'll jump in.
Sure.
Great. So in the foreword of the book, you write that you felt compelled to write this book right now. And I'm wondering if you can tell us why.
Yeah, well, I'm compelled for a number of reasons. One is a narrative has been created by the torture lobby, the torture advocates who established this program. And I'm deeply concerned with the national security that, you know, that there's been no accountability. And some of the people who designed the program continue to come out with a narrative that it's safe, necessary, and effective. And so if you just look at kind of how the program was established and evolved over a number of different congressional hearings, Senate Armed Services Committee hearings, Judiciary Committee hearings, Intelligence Committee hearings. What you see is the CIA established a narrative that it was safe, necessary, and effective. And they used medical professionals for medical cover and lawyers for legal cover. And what they did was they continued this narrative to deceive the administration. Mm-hmm. The CIA deceived the president, deceived the Congress, deceived the media, and deceived the public, trying to say that it was safe, necessary, and effective, and that there was something enhanced about the EIT program specifically. And the EIT program was nothing more than an excuse to inflict torture. And so one of the reasons I was compelled to write it was these torture advocates, this torture lobby, continues to echo those false sentiments that they started when they started the program. So for instance, Bill Harlow was in the communication shop working for George Tenet, the CIA at the time. And when George Tenet wrote his book, it was written with Bill Harlow. And then when Jose Rodriguez wrote his book, Hard Measures, it was written with the same person, Bill Harlow. And when the Senate Subcommittee on Intelligence came out with the Torture Report Executive Summary, they tried to gather some of these torture advocates together to try to respond to this congressional report. And they produced essays. And the editor of those essays was, again, Bill Harlow. And James Mitchell writes a book trying to purport himself to be a hero when he degraded our national security.
And just to say, James Mitchell is one of the two contract CIA psychologists who helped start the torture program, design and implement.
Correct. Yeah. The folks that I refer to as modern day snake oil salesmen, correct. Mm-hmm. And written his book with, again, Bill Harlow. And so you have those people who were involved in this program to start with. Because of that lack of accountability, echoing these same sentiments. If you see Larry James, a psychologist who was an enabler of this program, was critical, who if he made a different decision could have changed the course of history, he wrote a book called Fixing Hell, is what he called it, trying to purport himself to be a hero, when in fact he created the hell that he purports to have fixed. Right. And so I thought that the public needed an accurate historical record of what occurred, because so much misleading information was out there, so much false and fabricated information was out there to intentionally mislead, that I thought that I could put some facts out there that would help shape someone's opinion of what actually happened.
Yeah, and I think you do that. I mean, I think Sarah and I both were able to sort of digest the book, and you lay out this really clear case of sort of how the torture program progressed in the months and then years after 9/11. I want to ask you specifically about some of those tactics, because from our work and obviously from the historical record that's out there now, we know that a lot of these tactics were born of these U.S. military trainings that were meant to have people resist interrogation methods being used by states that don't comply with the Geneva Conventions. And somehow that evolved into these EITs, these enhanced interrogation techniques. How did that happen? How did we go from this protocol to resist interrogation, and then they sort of were perverted into these methods of torture?
And if I could actually touch on just a few points. You talk about the psychologist Martin Seligman and his sort of learned helplessness theories. And if you could talk about the marriage, as you refer to it, of the SEER, what that is, and those pressure tactics with this sort of pseudoscientific application of psychological theory, and just talk about the genesis of this program, the false confessions, and how it leads to a so-called intelligence function program.
Sure, and of course, as you know, I detail that in Unjustifiable Means, because here's what happens. If you look back at kind of after 9/11, we made some key decisions, policymakers, and they made decisions out of fear and ignorance and arrogance. And among those decisions, you had people who should have just stayed in their own lane. Mm-hmm. And particularly psychologists and people with what's called the JPRA, mm-hmm. the Joint Personnel Recovery Agency. And that agency manages a program called SEER. And it stands for Search, Evade, Resist, and Escape, Survive. And so what that tries to do, it's based on the manner in which our service members were brutalized by communist tactics in the North Korean War. And these tactics actually were used historically. I mean, torture has always been used to elicit information, not intelligence, but to get somebody to say what you want them to say for propaganda information. So what happened was that the Soviet Union, KGB, were using techniques that evolved around isolation and more psychological techniques. It's interesting historically, because they ensured that they called people detainees, so did North Koreans, rather than prisoners of war, mm-hmm. to dehumanize them. And as this program evolved from the KGB to the communists in China, and the communists in China refined it a little more, and then it went to the North Koreans. And these techniques produced false confessions. And so there was an Air Force social scientist named Albert Bitterman who produced a study that said communist techniques to produce false confessions. And that those techniques that he studied are the techniques that we try to sensitize our service members to in case they were captured by a brutal adversary or someone who doesn't observe the Geneva Conventions. And so what happened after 9/11, and it was interesting, it happened to be, and I detail the story in the book, and so does the Center Armed Service Committee, Detainee abuse hearings. I had a visit. I was sitting in my office, so I had headquarters I was the guy responsible for bringing terrorists to justice. So President Bush decided the federal court system was incapable.
Right.
And the FBI, the Department of Justice, declined cases for the FBI so that the Department of Defense could assume responsibility to bring terrorists to justice for this military commission process we have at Guantanamo. And I had a visit from the chief of staff from the JPRA. And a lot of people in the public didn't know what it was, and within the government, people knew that I was the chief investigator to bring Al-Qaeda to justice. And I was visited, and I had a lot of people visiting me offering help. Mm-hmm. And I was grateful. And the chief of staff from the JPR said, he explained what SEER was, and I knew what it was. I had been an NCIS agent, and I had interrogated many SEALs, Marines, and generals, and the things you do in the job. And he explained SEER, and I thought to myself, well, I'm certainly not going to submit my people to that stuff. We're not going to be captured. We'll probably let the SEALs do a raid, and then we'll come in afterwards. And he said, no, it's an interrogation technique. I said, what? That's not interrogation technique. That's just the opposite. That would make somebody resist more. And I said, plus, I've been working terrorists since the 90s. I've done this stuff before. I know how to interrogate. This is my profession. Mm-hmm. That's not interrogation. And I thanked him, and I must say I dismissed him, but I thanked him for offering his assistance. Little did I know until the Senate Armed Service Committee report came out that he also offered that service to, at the time, it was called another government agency, and since we know who that is, and to the Defense Intelligence Agency. Mm-hmm. And so I couldn't imagine anyone having accepted that as legitimate interrogation, just by the way he explained it. that you're going to abuse somebody, you're going to isolate him, you're going to humiliate them, so it was just so inherently absurd to me. And when he left, my staff of special agents from the Department of Defense kind of laughed, said, "Oh yeah, like the techniques all the Marines and sailors that we interrogate and confess receive," because it's abuse, it's torture. Mm-hmm. It's not a legitimate interview technique, and so that's what happened. Yeah. James Mitchell, who was a contractor with the CIA in 9/11,
and a psychologist.
Correct, a psychologist. Mm-hmm. He was a SEER psychologist. Mm-hmm. And SEER psychologists didn't administer the program. They observed the program. Mm-hmm. These weren't the SEER instructors. Mm-hmm. The psychologist was supposed to observe it. And he was hired under an applied research contract with the CIA. Well, he collaborated with another SEER psychologist named Bruce Jessen, who at the time was still in the Air Force. And they developed this, what they were calling counter-resistance strategies. The problem with that from a national security and professional perspective is they had absolutely zero experience with Al-Qaeda,
right?
Zero experience in the Middle East, zero experience doing any interrogations. I saw depositions with the ACLU where I think Mitchell was asked if he had experience doing interrogations. He said, "Well, I was a clinical psychologist. I talked to patients." Mm-hmm. I mean, that's how absurd, it is. And so people within the government adopted those techniques and applied them, but they were applying torture. They were applying torture to people, and it produced just what we knew it would: false and fabricated information.
I want to get to this idea of somehow these techniques that, as you said, provided false confessions, then earned credibility, earned credence within so many areas of the U.S. government apparatus. I mean, one of the things that you write is you refer to it as the torture Ponzi scheme. I wonder if you can explain what that means and how it is that health professionals like Mitchell and Jessen, but others as well, were involved in legitimizing these practices throughout the system.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to understand that there were competing psychologists. Mm-hmm. And so within agencies like NCIS, there are what's called operational psychologists. And these are career employees that assist the operators in developing strategies, assist in training. They don't do interrogations, they don't get involved directly with things, but they provide advice and counsel. I mean, my chief operational psychologist for NCIS was a guy named Mike Ellis, Dr. Mike Ellis. And Mike had helped me. We worked together through my career on arson cases, on undercover operations, on counterintelligence matters. And so when I got this mission to bring terrorists to justice, I called upon Mike and said, "I need your help." Mm-hmm. And the director of NCIS had very graciously allowed me to handpick my team and allowed me to go back into NCIS and bring people on. And so we brought together a team of full-time career operational psychologists from the federal law enforcement and intelligence communities. And we designed rapport-based approaches, ethical, lawful, humane methods to interview people. One, because they're lawful, and two, because they're effective. Mm-hmm. We know that if you inflict pain, it's going to produce fabricated. It's common sense, right? So there were full-time career operational psychologists who were designing the programs with me, while at the same time, the CIA in the shadows hires first Mitchell, later Jessen, two psychologists who had absolutely no experience, there was opposition within the CIA to that. And they not only designed, developed, and implemented that program, they evaluated it as well. And they earned millions of dollars doing so. And so what happened was, as I was trying to fight, as the torture techniques, the EIT program, these excuses to inflict torture, were spreading from the CIA to the Department of Defense, one of the reasons they were spreading was the fact that the CIA was purporting how effective they were, that we're getting useful information, we're getting actionable information, we're saving America, while my contacts in the CIA were saying nothing is further than the truth.
Can you help us understand why there was such an embrace of psychological exploitation? What was the wishful thinking or the opportunism behind this? Why is it that these these psychological abuse tactics, why did they resonate so much? I mean, partly what you touch on is there was just blatant lying about what they were doing and how they were impacting detainees. But from a sort of your perspective as a national security expert, why did people seize on this idea and get sold this snake oil?
Yeah, I think what you had opportunists. And so these psychologists who had no legitimate experience wanted to get involved in the worst way. And that's exactly what they did. They got involved in the worst way. And so what they were able to do by getting themselves involved, by interjecting themselves into a mission area that was not theirs.
Mm-hmm.
SEER is not an offensive mission kick. I mean, by doctrine. I mean, there's been congressional hearings about this. Mm-hmm. It is not a legitimate interrogation tactic or technique. And in fact, within the SEER community, the instructors call what they call exploitation. When they say exploitation, that means torture.
Yeah.
That means we're going to do it. But what they know is the psychological torture is more damaging than the physical. Mm-hmm. People will resist more to the physical torture, but the psychological torture, and it's intended to produce debility, dependency, and dread. And dreadful it was. Mm-hmm. And so that was by design. By design, they called it demonstrated omnipotence. Mm-hmm. And that's taken right from the North Koreans. So if you look at the doctrine the North Koreans use, you will see the same terms and techniques that we applied. So if you look at they try to couch the term so it's more sensitive, enhanced interrogation. They call them in Guantanamo behavioral management plans. We just want to manage detainees' behavior. That's all they do. We want to do it by depriving them of sleep, of dehumanizing them, of this learned helplessness, which was a technique. Mark Seligman was a former president of the APA. He's called the father of positive psychology, because he did these experiments on dogs, and he found that if you continue to shock a dog, the dog will learn helplessness. It won't know what to do, and will just be compliant. And somehow, these psychologists convince people that they confuse compliance with cooperation. And so you can get somebody to comply. The problem is you can't get somebody to cooperate by doing that. And so they applied those techniques, and the fact that I had operational psychologists on my side, the troubling piece of this is that by those inexperienced psychologists interjecting themselves, it countered my psychologists. Mm-hmm. So for instance, when I said, I have a team of the best operational psychologists in the business, and I'm convinced I did at that time, from a number of different agencies giving me guidance and advice. And I would bring that to the Pentagon and say, well, they have psychologists to Guantanamo too, and they say it works. And so it would just kind of undercut my argument, because they had what they were considering medical professionals. Mm-hmm. And legally, under the law, they needed those medical professionals there. Because when the OOC wrote their memos, the thought was, well, if psychologists were there, they would stop this. I mean, they would do no harm, when in fact it was the psychologists themselves that were doing the harm, who designed the harm.
Do you feel that the Bush administration's torture memos, which assigned a very critical role to health professionals from monitoring and sort of certifying some of these practices as safe, do you feel that that helped create the way for behavioral scientists, psychologists to play such a prominent role?
Yeah, no doubt about it. They needed the medical professionals there for the legal cover. And so the legal cover brought the medical professional there, the medical professional brought the legal cover there. So it was a way to cover the excuses to inflict torture. Mm-hmm. And the argument was, again, that this learned helplessness, as I looked across the spectrum at the time, they're trying to add this learned helplessness to this stuff. And at the time, I had no idea what it was until my psychologist told me. But it just, in hindsight, it's so bizarre that anyone would actually look at that objectively and say, "Oh, that's a good idea." Yeah, we're going to just continue to abuse someone till we break them. And they thought that they would break their will to resist, and with many, they just broke their will to live.
Can I follow up on the theme of opportunism? So I want to turn to Larry James, who, along with Morgan Banks, was one of two military psychologists who was involved in the American Psychological Association's efforts to craft ethics policies that, as we have come to learn, were intentionally permissive of psychologist participation in abusive tactics. And you write that James viewed Guantanamo as a career opportunity to psychologically exploit detained prisoners and was personally involved in the spread of torture at Guantanamo. So I would love to hear you talk a little bit about the role of some individual psychologists in helping the spread of these tactics that folks like Mitchell and Jessen developed to go from the CIA to go to Guantanamo and into other theaters, and touching specifically about the role of Morgan Banks and Larry James.
Sure. Yeah. So as we were in controversy, and so at Guantanamo, when we identified someone who was the 20th hijacker, Mohammed al-Qahtani, and so as we're looking at how do we best exploit it? Now, exploit him from an investigator's perspective is different than exploiting them from a serial perspective.
Right.
So how do we talk to this person to elicit reliable intelligence and untainted evidence? Because we want to get intelligence to prevent the next attack or find out about the last attack, and we want to bring this person to justice because he would have been the 20th hijacker had he got into the country. And so during that controversy, General Dunleavy, who at the time was the commander of what was called JTF 170, and it evolved into JTF Guantanamo, which it's called now. But their job was intelligence exploitation. He was urging harsher techniques, and he was fighting, and we were fighting him about that. He wanted to use waterboarding. He wanted to use these sear techniques that the CIA was using at Guantanamo. And as we were fighting those, and my operational psychologists were down there talking to the psychologists at Guantanamo, they didn't have operational psychologists down there at JTF 170 or Gitmo. What General Dunleavy saw was the fact that in my arguments to use rapport-based approaches, I was using my psychologist to bolster my argument. So I was saying, I have Dr. Mike Gellis, I have Dr. Robert Funk, and there are others who were redacted from my book, so I can't mention their name, but from other agencies within the intelligence community that are helping guide me as a leader in what to do. And so General Dunleavy didn't have any. And so in these battles between his task force and my task force in the Pentagon, he decided he was going to get his own psychologist. So he took clinicians. He took a psychologist and a psychiatrist, and he said, you are now my BSCT, which I call pseudo BSCT, because I created, what do we call this collection of people that brought together? So we called it the Behavioral Science Consulting Team. And as Mike Gellis always explained to me, I'm going to do one of three things to you. The first is highly unlikely. It's highly unlikely I'm going to tell you something so insightful that it's revolutionary and you're going to grasp it. The number two is I may tell you something that maybe just changes your mind a little bit about how you look at things. And the third, I may just kind of confirm a little bit of what you think you know based on some of the science I can tell you about. And he always described his position as kind of in the bleachers, looking down at a game in the field. So he sees it from a different perspective than those of us who are on the field of play because of that bird's eye view. And as a leader, it's my job to either take his advice or not take his advice. And sometimes I did, and sometimes I didn't. Well, what they did with the other psychologists, when they were struggling, when he created this team who had no experience, one of the psychologists, one of the people down there, according to Fixing Hell by Larry James himself, called him and didn't know what to do because they wanted to go down this road. Now, as an officer in the military, Larry James could have and should have referred him to the actual agency within the Army that's responsible for interrogations. And so the Army has the overall executive agency responsibility for interrogation programs, but he didn't do that. And he was actually interned with my chief operational psychologist, Mike Gellis from NCIS, whose reputation in the community was superb as an operational psychologist. Didn't refer them to Mike Gellis or anyone else. Instead, referred them to Morgan Banks, who was a SEER psychologist, again, without this interrogation experience. And so those are the tipping points, the key decisions. There were certain points historically that could have changed the course of history. And had Larry James reacted a little bit differently, had he actually said, wait a minute, let me refer you back to an agency responsible for interrogations, or but not to SEER. And the same thing with Morgan Banks. We had called Morgan Banks when we heard them doing this SEER. Mike Ellis called him and said, they're trying to do this. And so I was using Morgan Banks' argument because he told us you shouldn't use this. This is not designed as interrogation. This will produce false information. So I was using that information in the Pentagon. I was using Morgan Banks to bolster my arguments. Now, I hadn't talked to what Mike Ellis had. And what I didn't know until later was, at the same time, he was arranging SEER training for the people at Gitmo in the shadows.
Right.
And so, as Mike Ellis said, he speaks out of both sides of his mouth. So that undercut my argument so much. That was another tipping point. So when I was in the Pentagon arguing why you shouldn't do these things, I have psychologists. I have Morgan Banks, who's down at the SEER school, saying you should do it. They say, well, then why is he arranging training for that back down there? Yeah. And so it totally undercut me trying. So particularly within the Department of Defense, those were kind of the two key points when someone could have made an individual personal leadership decision that I need to react a little differently than I had. And since then, I've seen Morgan Banks say he doesn't believe in this and other things. So again, Mike says he speaks out of both sides of his mouth. I've seen things where he says that he has opposed this. I hope both of them do at this point. I don't know whether they do or not, but I do know what they did to my position, back in 2002, 2003, 2004. When I was fighting this within the Pentagon.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think is interesting is this sort of conventional wisdom around the torture program. We talk about a few bad apples. We focused a lot, and even internally at PHR, we've done a lot of advocacy around the Mitchell and Jessen lawsuit that settled earlier this year. I mean, the picture that you paint, and even in the subject of the book, is a conspiracy that really isn't just a few bad apples. I mean, the story that you just told is basically one of predetermined outcomes. It's one of people wanting to hear things that would justify torturing other people. I mean, how did that narrative play out, and what did you witness either at Gitmo or elsewhere of where that was happening in this whole process?
Yeah, and so when Gitmo, with medical professionals, psychologists and psychiatrists, and whether they're professionals or not, maybe you guys might have a different opinion about that. But when they developed these techniques, and again, they're the same techniques that were used against us. These weren't, the CIA said, we re-engineered them. They didn't re-engineer it. The only thing they did is they had to learn how to use these techniques. You can look at them from Albert Bitterman right down. They actually, in some of the training, the PowerPoint actually had Bitterman's slide that said, produces false confessions. So the real question is that what we intended from the first place? Were these policies, practices implemented knowing that they would produce false information? I don't know how you could be a SEER psychologist and advocate for this as an interrogation technique because it produces false information. And the other irony, if you can call it that, the Navy was the only service that waterboarded. And they stopped because the SEALs or whoever were waterboarded would capitulate. They'd give up. They'd tell whatever they wanted to hear. And so, Morgan Banks with the Army and Mitchell and Jessen with the Air Force, they weren't services that even waterboarded. They had to go to the Navy to learn how they did it.
So, taking up this theme of sort of the command structure and this predetermined narrative, one of the things that your book talks about is there's different moments at which people were confronted with the decision of reporting abuses or voicing their concerns, and some people did the right thing and other people did not. And, following orders is not a defense, and for health professionals, nobody is allowed to, participate in torture, observe it, but health professionals have a very strong prohibition against it. So for folks like, Banks and James and Mitchell and Jessen, who were pushing for this SEER-based torture program and who, claim that it wasn't abusive, what is the sort of proper historical look at their decision making? What should happen? What do you think? How should we judge? How should history judge these decisions?
Well, I know when I saw the techniques coming to get more from the CIA, it said somebody needs to be considering how history will look back on this. And another reason I wrote the book, I wanted a historically accurate, factual-based book there that, you can go back, this is all based on investigations that occur, congressional hearings. It's a fact-based book. I was investigated for a number of decades. And so there needs to be some form of accountability. And I know when President Obama said, we need to look forward, not backwards, I think that was a mistake. And Pat Leahy, Senator Leahy on the Senate Judiciary Committee said, if you do that, you open the door for torture in the future. At least hold truth commissions. If you don't want to prosecute people because they claim they were acting for their country, have some mechanism that they are accountable. And that lack of accountability, I know there's a huge controversy in the APA over this about psychologists involved, and there were things like Penn's report, and there was votes against psychologists being involved in national security matters, and so there's a huge controversy within that community, a community that had a lot of friends. I work with research psychologists now. I have a former operational psychologist who are very close to me, and so what I urge people to do is stay in your lane, play your position, okay, and that's, you want to say, the problem I have with this. You have people it wasn't their job. Rather than supporting the operator, they decided they would become the operator. So rather than being like Mike Gellis was to me, giving me advice and counsel, here's my opinion, it's not. They were in the room spinning people around in chairs. They were designing these techniques. So play your position. Don't, you want to get involved in worse ways. Unfortunately, you jeopardize your national security by doing so.
And you've heard this, I think, we've been talking about the rehabilitation of torturers. And you've heard this line about these were extraordinary times, that people were scared. You even heard this from the Obama administration, that people were fearful about what was going to happen next. And you have some insights on this, and I'm curious to get them. That this idea that stay in your lane, even when the circumstance seems extraordinary.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a national security professional and you can't do your job when you're scared, get another job. That's what we're paid for. That's what you should expect of me. And that's what I expected the people that I work for and that work for me. And so when I hear people in the CIA say, "Oh, we were afraid," well, then do your job better. You don't resort to torture tactics because you're afraid. I mean, torture is an act of cowardice. I mean, they're cowards, those people who torture human beings like that. I mean, it's horrific that Americans would do so. Those of us who've taken the oath of office to protect and defend the Constitution, that's against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And so you have an obligation to stand up. You cannot and must not follow an illegal order. And so we didn't have enough of that. I tried to point out the heroes in this book. I mean, I tried to point out the dog handler who wouldn't let his dog abuse a detainee. That is buried somewhere in the Taguba report. I wanted to name him, the personnel who stood out in this. The judge advocate generals of each of the services opposed this. They knew it would be detrimental to our troops. They knew that you have to observe the Geneva Convention. It makes our troops less safe if you go down this road. So the judge advocate, but they were all, and so their voice was not heard. Fortunately for me, Alberto Mora, who was the general counsel of the Navy, he was the one who listened to me. And I took my complaints up my Army chain of command, my Secretary of Defense chain of command, and then finally when I thought they would kill Mohammed al-Qahtani at Guantanamo, I went back to my parent organization, NCIS, and said, "You've got to do something. I mean, we're going to kill a detainee." And someone from the CIA came to Guantanamo and said in October of 2002, "If a detainee dies, you're doing it wrong." And in November, Will Rockman died in a dark, dank cell in the CIA black site, chained to a wall, naked from the waist down. And so that's why this is important. That's why we can never go down this road again.
Now, when you're talking about the person who said that if a detainee dies, you're doing it wrong, you're specifically referring to a CIA lawyer who briefed folks at Guantanamo, I believe, and it is striking for people who are both familiar and unfamiliar with his history that even as these horrific harms are being are manifesting in the CIA black sites, that the DoD is still choosing to take these tactics and put them in place at Guantanamo and let them spread elsewhere. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your sort of firsthand experience with watching this train wreck happen and watching clearly abusive tactics and torture still somehow move forward.
Yeah, I think I described in the book as I felt like there was an avalanche, and you could see those rocks coming, and you wave your hands and do what you want to try to stop it, but you're eventually going to get crushed. And I got crushed.
Yeah.
Okay, so you could envision, I mean, I said this is the type of stuff congressional hearings are made of. You could see this train coming at you, but you couldn't, there's an insatiable appetite by some people to want to torture. I mean, General Dunleavy at Guantanamo said that we weren't being harsh enough with the detainees. General Miller came in and they created what's called the frequent flyer program, which sounds very innocuous. And that's where you wake someone up in the middle of the night constantly, move from cell to cell to disrupt them, to show them you're in charge, you're in control. And so seeing that happen, and I can envision, how this would just have people react against us. How from a strategic perspective, that it would create more adversaries, more enemies. Or we're going to try people in these unjust courts, and if people are released, aren't they going to tell these tales? Mm-hmm. And so we went from Al Qaeda when I was working the attack on the USS Cole, the investigation. We estimate Al Qaeda probably numbered between 200 and 400 people. Mm-hmm. How many tens of thousands of Al Qaeda-like organizations are out there? It's a brand name. How many children are in basements in the United States now, looking at videos about our abuses, being recruited to ISIS and Daesh and other things? I mean, these things are so horrific internationally that we've jeopardized our national security. The greatest threat to our national security after 9/11, in my opinion, it wasn't from the second attacks. It was from the manner in which the CIA and DOD implemented this EIT program, because it has created terrorist financing, it has created terrorist recruitment, and it has made it less safe globally.
I think it's pretty obvious that right now in the United States, there's a president who has at least shown some willingness to consider some of these practices that were implemented after 9/11. And I'm wondering if you can offer your insights into the safeguards that are in place and whether you think they're adequate to preventing this kind of avalanche from happening again.
Yeah. Probably 2 years ago, I would have thought they were. After the McCain-Feinstein Anti-Torture Act was approved, and I went up to Capitol Hill and I lobbied for that, and I spoke to senators, I gave presentations. I would have thought we'd gone there, but I'm afraid that legal loopholes can still be found. And so in President Obama's first week in office, he said we won't torture. And he issued an executive order, 13491, that said we won't do that. We will adhere to the things we're supposed to, the Geneva Conventions, the Convention Against Torture, U.S. law. And fast forward to President Trump's first week in office, he wanted to abandon that executive order. Mm-hmm. He wanted to go back and look at, should we be using the CIA again? Because he is who he said he was. During the campaign, and he said he was going to build a wall. Well, there's going to be some wall somewhere. And he said that we're going to do worse than waterboarding, and I'm convinced we're probably going to do worse than waterboarding. And here's what you and your viewers need to understand is, the first time, you were never supposed to know about this. Nobody was ever supposed to know. Mm-hmm. Those people this was supposed to be done to them. They were never supposed to see the light of day, and you were supposed to never know about it, and other people in the CIA were never supposed to know about it. So it wasn't until Abu Ghraib came and blew up that derailed this program totally. And so right now, I'm not confident that there's not some type of memorandum of notification or presidential finding for covert action where we have the Washington Post finally just put an article out about a U.S. citizen that is in custody. Right. The U.S. citizen is in custody right now, being held somewhere at some location, and I don't know his conditions of confinement. I don't know who is doing his interrogation, whether enhanced or not. I know what's legal and illegal, but I knew that before too, and we still did it. And I don't know what the disposition of this U.S. citizen is going to be. And is this going to be something before the Supreme Court? Is President Trump going to try to put a United States citizen in Guantanamo Bay? Or is he going to try to bring him to an Article 3 court back in the United States? Or is he going to hold him indefinite detention somewhere else? I don't know the answers, but that could trouble every American.
When you look at the prison that exists at Guantanamo, What do you think Americans and other people need to understand about it? Your perspective as a national security expert, and also your just broader perspective with your familiarity with this program.
Yeah, when I first got this mission, the mission to be the chief investigator for the commission process, I thought it was an incredible opportunity. I mean, I was honored. I thought I was going to serve my country. I thought I was within the Department of Defense. I thought no one was positioned better because of my history in working on cases on Al-Qaeda since the 90s, working with the FBI and the Joint Terrorism Task Force. And I was told we'd have the worst of the worst. I was told Guantanamo would be for only those detainees that were high-value targets for intelligence exploitation and high-value targets to bring to justice. And so I thought it was an incredible opportunity. It didn't take long for it to become an opportunity lost. And so we started it became, I call it dirt farmers in my book, but what we just indiscriminately picked up people for bounty. It was modern-day human trafficking, and warlords and tribal chieftains were just giving us property, and we were buying it. And rather than effective screenings in Afghanistan in theater, we just shipped them off to our own Devil's Island, Azkaban prison, right? And left them there. And I remember
a Harry Potter reference, by the way, that Slavi made in his own book as well.
And General Leonard, the Marine general who started Guantanamo, started building those facilities. I remember him saying, it takes an Army captain to get someone to Guantanamo. It takes the President of the United States to get them released. And so that opportunity became an opportunity lost. And so now what could have been a symbol of justice, what could have shown the world that we are that shining city on the hill, now, unfortunately, is a symbol of torture, injustice, and oppression. And so some of the studies being done about what has brought foreign fighters to the battlefield to kill us. In Iraq in its heyday, when we were shedding blood, the foreign fighters were pouring into Iraq to what was called Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which there had not been before we invaded and brought an Al-Qaeda element to Iraq. They said the number one and two reason that foreign fighters came to the battlefield to kill us was Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay. And so we need to get more strategic in our approaches. We need to have less people that want to kill us, not more.
Look, I know Sarah and I have a lot more questions, but just so that everyone in the room knows that you're free to raise your hands, and if you've got questions for Mark or even for Sarah on her work, and same goes for Facebook Live. If you have questions coming through, you can add them in the comments below, and we'll bring them up as we can. I know, Sarah, you wanted to get another question, but just think about your questions, have them ready to go, and we'll be happy to facilitate.
I want to touch on your expertise as a criminal investigator, and I would love to hear your reflections on how torture has impacted the military commission's justice process and or lack thereof, and then just compound question, what this has to do with humane, lawful, report-based interrogation tactics, because I know you're working on an initiative with the former UN Special Rapporteur Juan Mendez, along with PHR's Dr. Vincent Iacopino and many others. And so, what is the relationship between torture, legitimate interviewing, and justice?
Yeah. Well, after the Cole was attacked, that ship was attacked on my watch. So I was the chief of counterintelligence operations for NCIS for Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. And I was the commander of the Cole task force for NCIS investigating the attack. And I vowed to myself not to rest until those people came to justice. And the problem with torture is it's our trying to hide torture that is not enabling us to bring terrorists to justice right now. And so we're down to 41 detainees in Guantanamo. Some are in indefinite detention. We have a judicial process, if you can call it that. I'm not a lawyer. A lot of lawyers will not even call it that. I've heard General Baker talk about how illegitimate a process it is, and he is the Marine general in charge of the Military Commission's Defense Organization. I've read media accounts from Carol Rosenberg and others in Miami Herald about attorney-client meetings being eavesdropped upon. I've heard that defense academies have found eavesdropping devices in the ceilings. One of the learned counsels in a capital case, when you're going to put somebody to death, you need to learn a counsel. Well, one of the learned counsels recently resigned, said I cannot ethically continue because I don't believe my attorney-client information is protected from the government. And right now there's a challenge. The military judge is now challenging that. So we're going to come to a point now where will the military judge issue an order against a civilian defense counsel who's trying to do what he considers his ethical legal duty. And so we're in a very precarious position right now as a nation that claims to observe the rule of law. On how we're going to react to these things. You've had FBI agents try to recruit defense counsel as informants. And you know, I can tell you, having worked a lot in the federal courts, if a U.S. District Court judge heard that FBI agent, I'm sure, would find himself arrested for contempt of court. I mean, that would not be tolerated. But the fact that there's this military process in Guantanamo, I think, gives a little greater liberty to them to do that. Now, on to your second part of your question. And so those of us within the community, there's an effort right now. And so I mentioned that executive order by President Obama, 13491. And so a derivative product of that was what's called the High Value Detainee Interrogation Group. And that group has a research component. Mm-hmm. And so I was, since its inception, I've been on a research committee. And I was the first chair of that committee, now the past chair. But what we've been trying to do is take evidence-based research, take science, and say, okay, we know torture does not work. We know it's not only ineffective, it's counterproductive. But what does work? Mm-hmm. What are effective? We need effective means. We need to effectively interview and interrogate suspects to protect our national security, protect our public safety. And so what's nice about that is what the research affirms is what we have gravitated to anyway, both from legal reasons and ethical reasons, and from an efficacy perspective, is that the humane treatment of a person actually elicits more reliable and accurate information. And so it's that rapport and the techniques we use help memory and things like that. And so right now we're trying to now ensure that we are incorporating research, we're incorporating science into the practice of interview interrogation. And from an international perspective, they've even stopped using the word interrogation. Mm-hmm. Because while in the United States it's usually a legal threshold, we interview witnesses, we interrogate suspects. Internationally, interrogation evokes memories of torture. Mm-hmm. In many countries, and unfortunately in our country as well. And so they've adopted the term now, investigative interviewing. And so I spoke at the General Assembly in September up at the UN. And I've worked with Juan Mendez, the former Special Rapporteur for Torture, on his thematic. And so there's an initiative underway now where we're trying to get the United Nations to adapt universal standards for investigative interviewing that are all both human rights compliant, ethical, and evidence-based. Mm-hmm. Based on actual research to ensure that we're doing the best practices. And we're getting some very good support right now.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Mark. Yeah, so anyone in the room, and I'll repeat questions just so we make sure they get picked up by the microphone. And then Nadine, if you want to read out if there's any questions in particular from the Facebook Live chat, we can try to answer those as well. Anyone in the room?
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
I'm wondering if you could comment on if you think the lack, what I see as an apparent lack of a sustained popular movement among the public to call for the end of torture has allowed to continue in some form or other. Is it that there's still this cloak of secrecy around torture that the public just doesn't understand really the full extent of what's going on? Or is it that we are fearful or apathetic or something, and we're not, professionals, and so we're allowing our emotions to get the better of us, and in a way feeding into the narrative that if it works, okay, if it doesn't work,
Yeah, and the question is really about whether the lack of a sustained popular movement against torture is maybe a danger opening us up again to these kinds of things, whether or not there's there's significant mobilization of people to oppose torture practices? Is it because they're scared? Is it because there's still a myth that they're effective? You know, what your take is on that?
Yeah, I think it's all of the above. And so if you look at screenwriters, you know, Hollywood or television shows, the popular actor after 9/11, 24, right? The show 24 and Jack Bauer, and everybody wanted to be Jack Bauer. Well, I was the guy with the task force investigating Al-Qaeda, and we didn't do those things, right? And so, but in those television shows, the hero can what? Just resist the torture, and then just apply the right amount, and only get good and accurate information, and save the day and be very popular. And so that version is what the public goes to sleep with. In addition to that, you've all been misled by some agencies like the CIA, and so they've collaborated with Hollywood, and so they like to spread the myth that this stuff was affected those involved. And if you look at the surveys done, unfortunately, Americans like torture. And I don't know if it's we like revenge, but they always, in my opinion, do the surveys wrong. They say, do you think we should torture if it saves lives? And people then say, well, yeah, I guess. Rather than saying, do you think we should torture if it would cost hundreds of lives? If we torture one person and maybe save one life, then 1,000 people would die. Then you think we should torture? So they even phrase the questions wrong. And so, you know, I hope that there'll be more of a groundswell within the American public. They'll understand better the strategic, tactical, and operational consequence of torture, how it makes us less safe, how it's degraded our national security. But you know, we're challenged by society. We're challenged. I was up at West Point in a project on the tactical consequence of torture, and they told me they actually sent one of their generals to Hollywood after 9/11 and said, "Will you please stop glorifying torture?" Because we can't teach the cadets, we can't unteach them what they believe from your television shows, from your movies, because it's glorified in our movies, and they don't accurately reflect the actual cost and consequence on not just the torture, but the torturer. I know people who've tortured. I know how tortured they are from what they did today. It lives with them.
It's interesting. There's an anecdote in your book where an interrogator goes into a room in full cowboy dress, you know, cowboy boots, and really goes in there. And you mentioned that it's not just that the public was watching 24, but that, as you said, some of these individuals themselves were watching some of these TV shows and feeling that compunction. So, yeah. Sarah, do you have questions from the Facebook?
There's 2 questions from our viewers, and they're related, so I'll let you decide how to answer them.
Okay.
So the first is, can you say more about the counterproductivity of torture, including what the Senate Intelligence Committee report shows, and specifically the case of Ibn Sheikh al-Libi? That's the first question. That's from Dr. Iacopino. The second question I'll paraphrase. Why didn't psychology as a profession provide the necessary context for the public to understand how problematic these torture techniques are and how they originate from brainwashing and forcing coercion, forcing confessions out of POWs? And this is from Joyce Hunter.
Okay, well, the second question, Joyce, you'll have to ask the APA that. I don't know the answer to that question. I can answer the first question. And so Ibn Sheikh al-Libi was an emir of an Al-Qaeda training camp, the Calvin camp. And I was investigating Ibn Sheikh al-Libi. And I had folks, analysts studying all the camps. And Ibn Sheikh al-Libi was in U.S. custody in Baghdad. And I wanted to target Ibn Sheikh al-Libi to bring to justice, trial before military commission. The way the process worked was that the CITF, my task force, the Criminal Investigating Task Force, had to produce what's called a reason to believe determination. That was a reason to believe. So I would sign a document that would go through the national chain to the president. And only the president could decide who he would bring before military commissions. And so I think I signed the first 12 or 15 of those, and each one the president decided that we should bring those people to military commission. Well, Ibn Sheikh al-Libi, we never finished his reason to believe for the president because he was taken from Baghdad. And this is in the Senate Subcommittee of Intelligence report, was taken to Egypt, to another country, and was tortured. And Ibn Sheikh al-Libi said there's Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And when that information came to me, having worked Al-Qaeda for years, It didn't make sense. It didn't track with anything I had known from investigating this group since the 90s. It didn't track with any of the folks that we interviewed and interrogated during the cold. It didn't track with anything in the intelligence community. It didn't track with anything anybody else told us that we picked up in Afghanistan or anywhere else. It just didn't make sense to us. And I actually brought people back from the Pentagon. I brought them down to Guantanamo and everything. I said, come down here. This doesn't, look at our records. There's absolutely no string of intelligence that I have that would corroborate that statement that there's this Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And at the time, I didn't know it was coming from Libya. I was told, well, the CIA has a rock solid source, and this is, and President Bush went to Cincinnati, Ohio, and wanted to convince the public why we needed to go into Iraq. Part of his speech was there's Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Mm-hmm. And when Colin Powell went for the United Nations, part of his narrative to try to convince the world that they needed to side with us and invade Iraq was there was Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And Ibn Sheikh al-Libi, when he got out of Iraq, he said, he was debriefed, and he said, yeah, I just said that so the pain would stop. That wasn't true. And then, even after that, I never got Ibn Sheikh al-Libi to bring trial to military commission because he was transferred to Libyan custody. And in a cell in Libya, it was said that he committed suicide. And so dead men tell no tales. But what has happened is that shows that torture is not only ineffective, it's counterproductive, because you're going to make flawed policy decisions that cost how many lives? How many American lives have been shed in Iraq based on that flawed decision? Now, maybe we would have invaded anyway. Maybe we would have found another excuse to invade because we seem to want to have invaded Iraq at the time. But part of the narrative that got us there was based on that false and fabricated information from Ibn Sheikh al-Libi.
Great, thank you, Mark. Other questions in the room or online, we're happy to take. We've got a few more minutes left. I did want to ask, one of the things that you've talked about is creating a historical record. And it's interesting, your book actually made a little news itself because of the review process it had to go through. And you all and your publishers made the choice to actually keep the blacked out sections, the redacted sections in the book. And I'm wondering if that in any way, I can take a lot of lessons away from that, but I wonder if in any way that speaks to this problem of secrecy, this problem of, as you said, this program was designed to be shielded from public view, and it's only through journalists and other players and whistleblowers like yourself that it really emerged. What does this say to you about that culture of secrecy?
Well, the first thing I'd say is I'm not a whistleblower. What I did, I was a government official with a responsibility. And my responsibility was to protect and defend the Constitution. And that's what I did. I didn't take an oath in office to protect and defend Donald Trump, the Secretary of Defense. My oath was to protect and defend the Constitution. And so all of my actions were done through chains of command. I would never have given any classified information to the media, and never have. And when I wrote the book, I was meticulous in trying to ensure that I did not do that as well. I sourced it to where it came from, the information, because as a national security, I investigated people for compromise of classified information. I would not do that. I know some people wish I would, but I won't. So that's why the redactions are very bothersome, because I had the option of just publishing it because I knew it wasn't classified, and then saying, okay, I'll fight you in court. Mm-hmm. The ACLU had already agreed to represent me, and you want to take the, but I elected not to do that. I told the government, if there's things in there that you'd like to, I'll sit down with you. I'll tell you where I got them from. I'll tell you that it's open source. I'll tell you what congressional hearing, what investigative report. I have read them all. I have re-reviewed every bit of congressional testimony on C-SPAN on this when I wrote the book. I know this issue pretty darn well. And so the problem with redacting goofy stuff, and you'll agree some of that's pretty goofy. Anyone who reads it, you could read through what they're saying. I know people who were redacted from the book who were upset that they were redacted. They help with the book and they want to be in the book, yet they were redacted from the book. So they're not happy with that. But what that does is if you make that process a joke, it's going to encourage the next person to just publish. Mm-hmm. And then it's too late. The goal isn't to go after somebody after they've disclosed classified. The goal is to not disclose classified information. From a strategic counterintelligence perspective, what I spent a lot of my career doing. You want a good process to protect national security. And that's why the redaction in my book and other books that I'm aware of are that to me, they look like clear harassment. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're illegitimate and they're designed, it's the government called the slow roll. It's designed to disrupt me from trying to tell my story. And so that's the problem. The problem is someone else now, it will encourage them to just disclose classified or be that whistleblower and just give the information to the press and hide in the shadows because they're afraid to actually talk about it. And I'm not afraid to talk about it.
Yeah, clearly. Other questions from the room? Well, great. Mark Fallon, the book is Unjustifiable Means, the inside story of how the CIA, Pentagon, and U.S. government conspire to torture. Thank you so much. And of course, our own Sarah Doherty, our U.S. anti-torture lead here at PHR. And thanks for everyone for joining us online. This video will be posted on our profile so you can watch it again. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks for having me on.